I'm Allison from the Bondwell branch, and I'll be reading the prologue from Dorothea Benton Frank's All Summer Long. It's a great beach read. Easter Monday, April 6, 2015, Manhattan. Whether the subject of change was partners, possessions, or places, some people had an easy time letting go. A fixture in the crown of Manhattan's classic interior designers, Olivia Ritchie was not such a person. Over the years, she had enjoyed the privilege of observing the private and personal habits of the 1% through her work. She was surprised to discover that there were people, many of them in fact, whose closets weren't jammed to capacity with 20-year-old garments they thought would come back in vogue. Hers bulged with a kind of weird ferocity, as though the closets were populated by tiny, possessive museum demon docents that guarded the history of her style. These same people with the organized closets, whose clothing and accessories were usually spread over their other residences, which helped to explain why they were so neat, actually replaced the contents of their spice cabinets and pantries annually, and over-the-counter medicines were tossed out by their expiration dates just because it seemed like a good idea. Actually, someone on their payroll did it for them. Olivia didn't do any of those things. To begin with, she had only one home, and only a part-time housekeeper. Olivia Ritchie wasn't technically a hoarder, but she loved her collections and the precious possessions she had amassed over decades. She saved garments and linens simply because she loved the fabric or the workmanship. You could find them wrapped in acid-free paper and packed in acid-free cardboard boxes under the bed and stacked in the very top of the linen closet and armoires. There were scores of handbags and scarves and mountains of costume jewelry that had been out of style for a very long time. Sometimes she would use a detail from one of them to represent a motif in a custom wallpaper or fabric. Sometimes she used the object for color. She squirreled away all sorts of things because they could be an honest catalyst for inspiration. And if she truly tired of something, she managed to sell it to a client. Olivia had dozens of objets d'art and curiosities from all over the world, ranging from a 16th century Italian salt cellar, sometimes attributed to the school of Benvenuto Cellini, to dozens of ivory Japanese netsukis. She had miniature cloisonné boxes that played sweet music, tiny French clocks that chimed assertively on the quarter hour, and dozens of hand-carved Chinese puzzle balls. The intricacies of the puzzle balls never ceased to amaze her. They seemed impossible to her, impossible to envision as an artist, and impossible to render. All of these belongings, down to the most humble buttons in her button box, were poised to ignite her creative spark. These tools inspired Olivia's magic. She made the dreams of other people come true. At least that was the pleasant rationale to keep them all. But she couldn't keep her first husband, the philandering, financially irresponsible medical student she had married in her mid-20s, against the pleading of everyone she knew. 2 years into it, she came home one night to an empty apartment. All he left her was a note on the kitchen counter along with 10 milligrams of Valium. The note read, "Sorry, I can't do this anymore. You're too demanding and controlling. You really ought to get some help." He took every stick of furniture, the contents of the kitchen and linen closet, and needless to say, all the music. Oh, he left the wedding elbow on the windowsill in the living room, a choice that stung. She ripped the pictures into shreds and threw them off the balcony, watching as pieces of her dream floated down to 73rd Street. It took her a while to get over it. Olivia buried herself in work and built her business, one gnarly client at a time. After being single and, she would admit, very lonely, Olivia achieved extreme success and married again, this time with the blessing of everyone she knew. But she vowed never to answer to anyone again. There would be no mingling of resources this time around. She was in charge of it all and the happiest she had ever been. People said she had dreamed Nick into her life. Olivia was a lucid dreamer, something that drove her crazy because her dreams were so vivid it was hard to tell the difference between a dream and reality. Nick teased her without mercy about them, comparing her to a New Zealand tribe of indigenous people who confused them also. Her safe and jovial, much older than her, second husband, darling, poetic, professorial, and ever the perfect gentleman, Nicholas Seymour, was a lifelong student and teacher, and he didn't particularly care about power. Well, he was happy to cede control of their money as long as things went well. For 14 years of bliss, they had been flush and pretty much able to do as they pleased because her business thrived. Nick was like Olivia in that he also collected things. Nick had shelves upon shelves of gorgeous handmade leather-bound books whose spines were hand-tooled in gold leaf. His small study that held these treasures had a tiny wood-burning fireplace, a luxury in their type of building. The combination of lingering ghosts of wood fires over the years and old leather laced with the occasional Monte Cristo smelled better than any perfume on this entire earth, and Nick had an army of tiny cast-lead Confederate soldiers placed in battlefield dioramas on a few shelves, lit and protected by glass walls that looked like small aquariums. To his everlasting delight, the Union troops of General William Tecumseh Sherman did not and would never reflect actual history in his depictions. "It's a mighty powerful feeling for a modest man like me to be able to change the outcome of a war," he would say with a wink to a guest. "May I offer you a measure of my oldest bourbon?" Who could refuse? He and his visitor, usually a colleague or graduate student, would sink into Nick's well-worn and cracked leather armchairs and sip away into the evening telling stories about the South or European wars or just about the great beauty to be found in a line of Seamus Heaney's poetry. Nick, who could have been the prototype for Oscar Madison, was a man of many interests. The walls and file drawers of his study were filled with ancient rare maps used by explorers in ages long gone. His favorites were classified as cartographic curiosa, a term that referred to maps with geographical inaccuracies, such as misshapen continents or ones that showed places like California as an island. "Look at this," he said to Olivia one night, carefully lifting the brown paper away from a new acquisition, a 17th century map detailing North America. "This fellow de la Hontan was a French military officer stationed in Quebec. After he fought the Iroquois, he made this map." "Amazing," Olivia said. "Gosh, honey, didn't you wear that shirt yesterday?" "Yes. Is it a capital offense to wear a shirt second day?" "No, but it's wearing yesterday's lunch," Olivia said, and touched the rather large stain left by drips and splatters of the red sauce from spaghetti bolognese they had shared the prior day at a charming neighborhood restaurant. "Oh, I'll change it in a moment." "No, you won't. I know you. It would take an act of Congress." "I will. But listen to this." He shuddered and thought, "Women." What's truly amazing is that the literature he published along with it described a mythical place, one inhabited by a large and lavish tribe of Native Americans. "Mythical? You mean it's a lie?" Yes. In those days, who could call you out?" "Well, they didn't have Google Earth in the 1600s, Olivia said and smiled. "No, they surely didn't." Nick shook his head and looked at Olivia. "God, I just love this stuff." Although she didn't quite understand his fascination with old maps, Olivia and Nick shared an appreciation for fine craft in any discipline. Their treasures were an extension of who they were professionally and spiritually. They were an ideal couple, except that he was truly a bit of slob, and she wasn't exactly forthcoming about their finances. They forgave each other their indulgences in almost anything, really, but unfortunately for Olivia, the dreaded moment of truth had arrived. It was time for her to downsize with Nick, which meant selling their apartment and moving. Downsizing. It was a terrible term, one that woke her in the middle of the night with visions of misery along with her serious financial problems and gave her cold sweats. Downsizing. Even the sound of it was depressing. It implied all sorts of terrible things. Failure to maintain their lifestyle as it was. Getting out of the game. Yesterday's news. Done. Finished. Old. Down. What was down? Hell was down. She was going to hell. This terrified her, and for good reason. Nick thought they could both afford to retire, but Olivia knew they could not. And if the concept of downsizing didn't fill her with enough dread, they were moving to Charleston, South Carolina. She, a fourth-generation New Yorker, was walking away from the bright lights of the center of the universe. Her fingernails would be found embedded in the cement in front of the Decoration and Design building. This could easily prove to be the worst decision of her life. It was professional suicide. In the minds of her clients, she would be washed up. Moving away from New York would surely be a death knell. It tolls for thee, Olivia. Why in the world would a client in Manhattan hire an interior designer from anywhere else? New York still had all the edge, didn't it? But this was the agreement she had made with Nick, a confirmed bachelor, when they married 14 years ago. They sold his studio apartment and he moved in with her. When the time came, they would retire to Charleston, the land of his ancestors and his boyhood. He was beside himself, giddy with joy. I'd go anywhere with you, she'd said 14 years ago, and meant it then. By God, you're wonderful. You'll love a simpler life. Nick bellowed with thunderous affection on so many occasions, and he always meant it, too. You're an angel, and I'm a lucky man. But Nick, with his salt and pepper, closely clipped beard, and blue eyes filled with mirth, lived in a world of poetry and history and didn't have an inkling about how money or the world worked. He depended on Olivia's business acumen to manage their money, and she had done a splendid job of it. She said all their success was due to being lucky, and she was, until recently. It didn't take too many mistakes to throw her business into a downward spiral, and even though the mistakes weren't always hers, she ultimately took the fall. First, there was the $30,000 sofa that came in 2 inches short, and the manufacturer wouldn't take it back, and the client wouldn't accept. That sofa was now in a storage unit in Secaucus, along with other problematic items, and they all irritated the living hell out of her every time she saw them. Some people are just dreadful, she'd think to herself every time she made a delivery. Truculent behavior was one of the ugliest characteristics of the entitled and vastly wealthy. Sometimes her clients were completely unreasonable just because they could be. Next, there was a contract for the total renovation of an 11-room apartment on Upper Park Avenue. The profits from that job would have covered their living expenses for 2 years, but then the sudden stunning news of that client's explosive, tabloid-documented acrimonious divorce hit the news as though a gigantic rogue meteor had crashed into Times Square. From every corner of Manhattan, tongues were wagging like those of dogs galloping toward an overturned street vendor's pushcart. All of that anticipated income and all those deposits for fabrics, furniture, lighting, and rugs slipped right through her fingers and dissolved into a nasty puddle of her growing anxiety and despair. The identical thing happened when a major client was transferred to London and another to Sydney. Plans had been drawn by an award-winning architect to reconfigure the footprint of their apartments, in addition to plumbing and electrical plans. Fixtures had been ordered, exotic wood floors and paneled walls had been bought at auction, and then, wham, the rug was unceremoniously pulled out from under her feet, like Lucy with Charlie Brown's football. No one cared how this would impact Olivia professionally or personally. She gave the impression, because she did not pay whatsoever to ever lose your cool, that her business was so successful that their cancellations wouldn't change a thing. It wasn't true, and she never told Nick. Bad things come in threes, she said to herself. No, they didn't. They came as frequently as the fiendish gods of trouble could hurl the disastrous lightning bolts to earth. To round out her worries, their apartment on East 86th Street sold for much less than she anticipated. Well, the apartment, as you would expect, was a metaphoric jewelry box. The building itself was an unrenovated post-World War II ugly white brick monstrosity with low ceilings, clanging pipes, and no parking garage. These days, people wanted a view, a media room, and a health club in addition to every other amenity you could name. Dog walkers and concierge services? Yes. These days, people flocked not only to the west side, but to areas downtown and in Brooklyn, where you would not have touched your Manolo Blahnik Warren Edwards shod foot to the pavement a mere 10 years ago. Things just weren't going her way at all. So while Nick might have been getting used to the idea of retirement, she was anything but. She had to work and somehow make up her losses. If Nick knew how close they were to bankruptcy, he would die. Her insides quaked at the thought of the truth being discovered. Thankfully, she had a loyal client who didn't care if she lived on the moon. Hopefully that client would not abandon her when Olivia gave up physical proximity to her. So as it got closer to Nick's retirement, she took a deep breath and they put her co-op on the market. They got a buyer who was happy to pay full market value, but they couldn't get board approval. It finally sold, but not well. After 10 months and no offers, she signed a contract for a pittance, all cash. They would close in 90 days. She began to panic. Moving was no longer a promise, but a reality. One last worry? She had made the final decision about which house they bought in South Carolina on her own. She knew that the house she chose was far too grand for Nick's taste, but that particular house was what she needed for herself and for the image of her business she hoped to build there. "This is a disaster," she said, referring to the sale of their co-op. "It's like being robbed. Not to mention, how am I going to unravel years of pack rat habits in 3 months?" "Better days are coming," said her assistant, Ronnie Larini. "Besides, I'll help you." They were sharing a large Greek salad and a liter of sparkling water delivered from Vian Cafe around this corner, at the tiny but beautiful office she rented in a discreet residential townhouse on East 58th Street. "Thanks. I know you will. You always do. And I've got the lease on this place till October. Maybe you should keep it," Ronnie said. "Maybe," Olivia said, but she knew that she could not afford to sign another lease, not without new projects on the books. Ronnie could almost read Olivia's mind. She knew Olivia was completely overwhelmed, and it took something as cataclysmic as the nosedive she was experiencing to unravel Olivia. "I'll check the fine print. Maybe you can sublet." "There's a thought." "What's the rent?" "4, including maintenance." "We could easily get 6 on a sublet." "Easy. Or, how's this? We fix up the back rooms into bedrooms, and you stay right here when you come to town." "We'll see." "You'll be fine, Olivia. We've been to the edge before. Are you getting any sleep?" "Not much. Nightmares like mad." "You should start doing yoga again. It makes you put everything into perspective." Ronnie often referred to herself as Olivia's office wife. She may have only been 30, but she had made herself indispensable. In truth, Olivia wondered how she would live without her when she moved. But they had a sort of loose but optimistic plan to hold their relationship together by employing the services of frequent emails, FedEx, FaceTime, and Skype. And she would fly to New York twice a month and stay at the Cosmopolitan Club. Lord knows she'd paid membership dues for years, but was always too busy to enjoy the benefits. Or maybe she should give up the Cause Club, put a bed in the storage room as Ronnie suggested, and save some money. It had been decades since she'd had to reconsider her overhead. It was true that her expenses would be much lower in South Carolina, which would help their financial constraints. But could she generate enough business from there to get her out of debt? Could she generate any business at all? Would she really be as efficient without Ronnie by her side in flesh and blood? She had asked Ronnie to consider moving south with them, but Ronnie could not. The timing was all wrong. Ronnie was firmly tied to New York. Her 85-year-old mother was in assisted living, dealing with all the horrors of Alzheimer's. Her 2 useless siblings and their useless spouses lived in the Midwest in oblivion, pretending no responsibility. "I know you're right. I should go back to yoga," Olivia said, and fished out a large black olive from among the lettuce and tomatoes, popping it into her mouth. "I wish they'd pit these things." "I wish a lot of things," Ronnie said. "Me too." The Charlotte Observer says Dorothea Benton Frank is the queen of sassy Southern literature, and usually it's a lot funnier than just that prologue. But we have to set it up somehow. Hope you find a book you enjoy. Thanks. Bye.